Well, one of the few people who really doesn't need a major introduction, Linda Moulton Howe. Tonight she's got a series of very special programs, starting with Planet X. A story, Linda, that just fascinates everybody, doesn't it?
It does, and it keeps becoming more interesting. It was nearly 3 years ago, at the end of January 2016, I reported at earthfiles.com in my coast-to-coast AM radio broadcast then, that a new ninth planet, or Planet X, was indirectly discovered at the far edge of our solar system where the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud meet. The Kuiper belt is a disc-shaped residue of rocks, dust, and ice left over from our solar system's creation, and it extends from the orbit of Neptune out far beyond Pluto to about 50 astronomical units from our sun. And the Oort cloud of mostly ice and dust goes much further, starting where the Kuiper belt ends and extends for 3.2 light years from Earth in a spherical shape that surrounds our entire solar system, including the Kuiper belt. Now, I say Planet 9 was indirectly found in 2016 because, to date, no human on Earth has yet seen this hypothesized massive object. But Michael Brown, he's Ph.D. professor of planetary astronomy at Caltech in Pasadena, he announced back in 2016 that he was confident there was a huge object 10 to 20 times the mass of Earth moving in a big looping orbit all the way to the Oort cloud. Professor Brown simply calls it Planet 9 because he's the astronomer that got Pluto knocked down to a dwarf planet after it had been the historic ninth planet of our solar system for decades. It was 2003, and Professor Brown that year discovered another dwarf planet he called Eris out in the Kuiper belt, and it was more massive than Pluto. So it was Professor Brown who argued that Pluto should be downgraded from the ninth planet in our solar system to a dwarf planet in the Kuiper belt that surrounds our solar system. And he even wrote a book in 2010 that was called How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming. Well, when I first interviewed Professor Brown about the massive but still unseen Planet 9, he told me back then, quote, "It is like chasing a ghost. Whatever is out there, its mass is so great that its gravitational field pushes half a dozen other Kuiper belt objects to cluster together on the opposite side of Planet 9's huge looping orbit, or at least where they think it orbits," close quote. Now, that is why, so far, it is an indirect discovery. It's now late 2018, after several tries at the Keck and Subaru observatories in Hawaii to find Planet 9 in visible light and or infrared. Professor Brown says that it is, quote, still like chasing a ghost. After more refined computer calculations, he has reduced the expected mass of this unseen planet to be only 7 times more massive than Earth. And just a couple of weeks ago, I checked in with him for an update on his search for this elusive Planet 9 or Planet X that he is still trying to find. And he told me that he is planning another trip to Hawaii November 1st, and this time he thinks there is a chance that he'll finally be able to visually get to this big mysterious mass because they've been working on computer refinements. And, for example, he told me in a recent interview that calculations place this unseen body about 500 times further than the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So that is putting it in a spot that is something like 20 times further than Neptune. A good way out there, but they have narrowed down the focus. So he is deliberately going on November 1st to start another search because the new calculations predict that Planet 9 is close to a constellation that can only be seen by American eyes in the winter. Here now from the California Institute of Technology's Planetary Sciences Department in Pasadena, California, is astronomy professor Michael Brown.
Our predictions are that the planet is in the region of the sky close to the constellation Orion, which is one that everybody knows. The constellation of Orion is a winter constellation. That's when it's up in the sky. That's when you can observe it most. So we have to wait until that constellation is up, until the winter, before we can start looking to where we think it is.
What frequencies will you be looking in?
The best way to search for this is actually just at visible wavelengths, just like your eye, because so far the brightest part that we think it's going to have is just the sunlight reflected off of its upper atmosphere. And so we're just going to look right at what your eye would see, just taking pictures with that big telescope.
What about infrared?
Infrared is not going to be a very good one for searching, simply because we don't have any telescopes with really massive infrared detectors that can look at big areas of the sky at once. Once we find Planet 9, looking at it in the infrared to study it will be very important. But it's not probably the best way to look for it.
Isn't it amazing that all of this impact on the solar system, the perturbations, and even tilting the plane of the solar system 6 degrees to the sun, that it would be caused by an object out in the Oort cloud that we can't even see yet?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fun to think about it. We just don't know where to look yet. It'll be easy to see once we know exactly where to look, I suspect. And then once we see it, then we will study it in detail with probably, every large telescope on the Earth will suddenly swing in that direction. So it will be quite exciting when it's finally found.
This new Planet 9 is hypothesized to be 5,000 times more massive than Pluto that you got knocked down to a dwarf planet.
Yeah, so it's a good reminder of the difference between things that are not real planets like Pluto and real planets. Sometimes people say, oh, this new Planet 9, it's just a little bit bigger than Pluto, right? Like, no. It's 5,000 times more massive. This is what we mean when we say a planet in the outer part of the solar system.
When we last talked, I think you had two categories of where might this have come from? Why is this massive object all the way out to the edge of the Kuiper belt going into the Oort cloud? And you talked about possibly it being a captured rogue planet, or that it was inside of our solar system where Neptune and Uranus are, but that it got knocked out by Saturn or Jupiter. What do you think today?
I still favor the explanation that it came from inside our solar system and got knocked out by Jupiter or Saturn. But until we find it and know exactly what its orbit is and exactly what its composition is, all of this is just speculation. You can probably come up with many different ideas to explain how it got there, but once you find it, I hope we'll really start to learn why it's there and what it's made out of.
You've been living with this now for 3 years. Do you have any sort of intuitive sense of what it could look like?
My best guess is that it will look sort of like Neptune. We think it's a Neptune-like planet, just a little bit less massive than Neptune. And so it'll be a gaseous atmosphere. It probably won't have clouds. It's probably too cold to have any clouds up in the atmosphere. So, in fact, it might be quite bland, a mostly just kind of grayish-white atmosphere with no features in it. But it's easy to speculate that. We are almost always surprised when we find real objects. And so the one thing that I know for sure is that there will be things about it that we never even thought about that are completely surprising.
Exactly how far from Earth to where you think this object is?
We think it's about 500 times further distance than the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So that puts it at something like 20 times further than Neptune, for example. So it's a good ways out there.
And is that a quarter of a light year?
Oh, no, it's not even close to a quarter light year. It's about 2.5 light days.
2.5 light days from Earth. Is that the border between the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud?
Well, that's actually a really good question to which we now don't know the answer. Before we realized that there's a planet out there, we thought we knew about the border. But now that there's a planet where that border we thought was, now we're less sure because we don't know what is beyond that planet, and we don't quite yet know how that planet is affecting what this border is.
What was it that made you, an astronomer, realize that something 10 times the mass of Earth could be there in the first place?
Yeah, the clue that there is another planet out in the solar system really came from looking at the very most distant objects that are in orbit around the sun, well beyond Pluto. They travel extreme distances, and all of these ones that are this far away all sweep off in one particular direction, and there's no reason they should. They should be randomly around the sky. The fact that they're all off in this one direction can only be explained by the presence of a planet that's perturbing their orbits and keeping them piled up in that direction.
And that what the new headlines in October of 2018 are about is one of those smaller objects that's being swept off by whatever the massive, we'll call Planet 9, that you discovered in 2016.
That's exactly right. Although I don't use the word discovered yet. I would say we proposed the planet, and when we see it, it will have been discovered.
What do you say to people who ask questions about rogue planets and the Nibiru of the Anunnaki or Sumerian and all of that? Because it does come up a lot. What exactly are rogue planets? How can a planet be wandering in the universe between solar systems and galaxies?
There certainly are these wandering planets, rogue planets, and they come about from the same sort of reason that we think that Planet 9 is out there. They certainly formed around a star, just like our planets did, and then probably a couple of planets got too close to each other, and one of them got tossed out. Usually the smaller one gets tossed out by the bigger one. And in our case, we think that that happened to Planet 9, but Planet 9 didn't get tossed quite far enough. So now it's just hanging around on the outer edge. But if it had gotten a little bit closer to, say, Jupiter, it could have been completely ejected from our solar system, in which case it would just be wandering through space. And so it is absolute certainty that these sorts of things exist. There's no question about it. When people ask me about Nibiru, that's always a funny one because, of course, that's a conspiracy theory that there's a giant planet that's going to destroy the Earth that NASA knows about and won't tell anybody and things like that. And I try very hard to explain to people that this is just crazy YouTube, internet conspiracy stuff that actually makes no sense.
Explain for a general world audience why something massive like a planet cannot sneak up on Earth and the inner planets without every astronomer on Earth knowing.
If something like Nibiru, I don't know what the latest crazy conspiracies are saying, how big it is, but occasionally you'll read a headline that it's going to destroy the Earth on some particular date because it's screaming into the inner solar system. Usually, if you do just a very quick calculation, you realize if it were really coming, it would be so bright that you could see it with binoculars. Every person who owns binoculars on the planet could go look and see it coming. You wouldn't be able to have a NASA conspiracy keeping it secret. And it would have been visible to every backyard astronomer with a telescope for the past decade, and it would have been visible to every professional astronomer for the past 50 years. If all of these people are in on the conspiracy, I don't know anywhere else where that many people are all keeping a secret from the rest of the world.
If something 10 times the mass of our Earth were even out past Pluto, out in the Kuiper belt, what would be the obvious observational changes, perturbations in our solar system?
In the inner part of our solar system, the inner part meaning the planets that we know of, Planet 9 has no effect whatsoever on the inner planets, and you can figure out why. It's 10, we actually think more like 7 now, 7 times the mass of the Earth, and it is 500 times further away from the Sun than the Earth is. Jupiter, on the other hand, is 300 times the mass of the Earth, and it's only 5 times further from the Sun than the Earth is. So Jupiter has a tremendous effect on the planets in the solar system, and nobody sits around and is worried that Jupiter is suddenly going to come destroy us. Planet 9 is really far away and quite a bit smaller than Jupiter, so its effect is really minimal. The one effect that it does have is that over 4 billion years, it is capable of slowly tilting the orbits of the planets. But even that is just a very, very minor effect.
If you're going to Hawaii in November and maybe you'll be successful this time. Would it be possible to talk with you in December about what you might find, or do you have to wait to do papers? Or
Yes, the way the process works is we'll go there in November, we'll collect the data. It'll take us several weeks to a month to process the data from November. Then we're back there the 1st of December, and we'll do the same thing. And so if we have found what we're looking for, we will know it within a month or two of collecting those data. And then at that point, we'll announce its existence as soon as we can confirm it. We will have found it, we'll go back to the telescope and double-check that it's really there, and then we'll announce its existence right away. We won't make the world wait.
Good. So January of 2019, it is possible that 3 years after 2016 January, when we did our first interview about it, that you might be able to confirm it.
It's possible. I'm always very optimistic. Konstantin Batygin, my partner in all this, is always much more pessimistic. And so, you should take my optimism with a grain of salt and then take his pessimism with a grain of salt. He thinks it'll take us another 10 years. I think it'll take us 1 year. So maybe that means still another 3 years. But I'm still very optimistic.
So there you have it, George, right from the man who discovered this, in terms of those perturbations of those half a dozen bodies that are all kind of gathered together out where the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud in that area. And I think one of the most important parts of doing these research projects with these scientists is that I have no confusion about the fact that if there was something massive that was trying to move into our solar system, what is called the inner solar system, from Mercury, the Sun and Mercury, out to where now Neptune and Uranus are, because Pluto has been dumbed down to a dwarf planet out in the Kuiper belt, that there's nothing that could be out coming this way and massive that wouldn't be picked up by everyone everywhere, because gravity, that's the thing about gravity and mass. It would have impact on every single thing in the solar system.
Absolutely. I would have loved, though, Zecharia Sitchin to have been alive to talk with the professor. I wonder if he would have been able to convince him about that Nibiru.
Well, I don't know how much time we have left, but I can start my own short piece that I had a discussion face-to-face, eye-to-eye with Zecharia, and maybe what I'll do is save that for conversations with Linda, because it's really quite a story. Okay,
we can do that too. But it's a great story, and it's really exciting that even if he doesn't agree in some of the theories that are out there, the fact that there's this extra planet out there does echo what some of these people have said long before anybody even knew about this stuff.
Well, the idea that there could be a massive planet, but when you read, let's say, about the Anunnaki through scholars, and you do the translations that were carved in stone, and you look at the carvings, the one thing that always is confusing to me is he talked about a 12th planet, but in the cuneiform, there are 11 dots.
We're back with Linda Moulton Howe, whose story next will deal with climate change. Linda?
Yes. It was 30 years ago in 1988 when the world was really kind of waking up seriously for the first time to global climate change and real potential dire consequences in the future if we didn't get on top of expanding methane and carbon dioxide blankets around the Earth. And at the United Nations, many countries, especially those worried about being islands in which sea level rise could flood and displace populations, they came together to form the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC. And the objective was to provide data about Earth changes on an ongoing basis to help project some of these impacts on world politics and the economies. By 2015, only 3 years ago, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, many small island nations were so worried about disappearing under rising sea levels that the IPCC committed to doing a 2018 report written by 91 scientists from 40 countries. The question was, should humans restrict global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius below pre-industrial levels? The October 2018 IPCC answer is the stricter 1.5 degrees Celsius equal to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit should be the new target to achieve and hold in place by 2030. That's only a decade from now.
That's right.
Because if we don't, if our planet continues to warm up above that limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, scientists warn there will be a catastrophe of mass die-offs. They will accelerate in the coral reefs, and if they die, that kills off other marine species dependent upon the coral. Weather will become more violent in winds, flooding rains, and devastating wildfires. Weather extremes will cause famine and fighting over land, food, and fresh water. And sea level rise will force more and more island and coast populations to move. But to where? The 2018 IPCC report said the next 10 years between now and 2030 are crucial. And in order to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, nations must cut greenhouse gas emissions by almost half of what they were in 2010. Solar, wind, and other renewable energy sources must replace as much as 67% of today's electricity. Coal, as an industry around the world, it must be phased out. The coordinating lead author of the IPCC report says, quote, "There's kind of a head-in-the-sand mentality that has taken root now in Washington, which seems to pretend that this climate change threat does not exist. But this was widely acknowledged in the defense community, meaning the Pentagon, as recently as 3 years ago in 2015, close quote. He is Professor Drew Shindell, Ph.D., Professor of Earth Sciences in the Earth and Sciences Division at Duke University, and he joins us now from Durham, North Carolina.
Could you please give me the top 5 places in the United States where water is coming in and flooding is already making people move?
I would say those are Florida, Alaska, and around the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland and Virginia, and Louisiana. So those would probably be the top 5 for the United States.
And where would be the 5 top nations in the world that are now islands and other places that are most affected by sea level rise?
Around the world, unfortunately, all too many very low-lying countries, and that's a large part of why we have this new report. Those countries wanted the United Nations to investigate a lower warming target, thinking that 2 degrees was probably not sufficient to protect them. Those are most of the islands in the South Pacific, also Maldives in the Indian Ocean, many Caribbean countries. And then there are very low-lying countries like Bangladesh, where the bulk of the population lives very close to sea level. Nigeria has a huge population right near sea level, but so does most of the world. China and the United States also have enormous populations right at the coast.
And where in Alaska?
In Alaska, you have an interesting problem where it's a combination of rising sea levels and melting ice, and the ice protected the shorelines from the waves from the ocean. And without the ice, the waves can reach the shore more easily, and the waves are higher because of rising sea levels. And so a lot of coastal communities along the west coast in the Bering Strait area, many of them are already having to be evacuated and moved to higher ground. So it's not so much the north slope, but the south and west coasts.
And who is paying for that?
I believe that's a combination of federal and state governments.
Already moving people in Alaska from flooding to higher ground.
Yeah.
And is that happening in Louisiana, Florida, North Carolina as well?
There's not been so much evacuation of the coast. There's been more what used to be rare flooding events and are now becoming quite common. So I think that there is likely to have to be evacuation in the next couple decades of at least some places. There's an island in the Chesapeake, for example, between Maryland and Virginia. More than half of it is already gone. And we've seen seawater come up through the drains into Charleston, South Carolina, and Virginia, where nuisance flooding that was very rare has become so commonplace that governments have had to put up markers so that motorists can see how deep the flooding is. It's so routine. And Florida has been some of the worst. Flooding of streets in the southeast part of the state has become fairly routine as sea level rise has continued, and we've seen an acceleration because both the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are melting more rapidly than was expected just a decade ago and dumping more water into the ocean. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing over the past several decades since we started to generate these projections from computer models and then watch the models have often been too conservative, and things are happening faster than the models project.
Can you give an example of what has been dramatic compared to the computer model?
One thing was the loss of sea ice in the Arctic. It went like 2 or 3 times faster than the models projected.
If the Arctic has melted 2 to 3 times faster than the computers projected already by 2018, is that a harbinger of the fact that it's likely the warming and melting of ice will keep increasing faster, like what happened in the Arctic?
Well, we have been observing from satellites that melting of the Greenland ice sheet has been accelerating. So that is definitely a worry. It is extremely challenging problem to figure out exactly how this massive ice sheet might become destabilized based on, say, melting from the top with water slipping down through cracks in the ice sheet and lubricating the bed below. You know, we worry because the warming has been so fast in the Arctic that the acceleration will continue.
And we're speaking in October of 2018. What would you project we will be seeing as more dramatic weather events between 2018 and 2030?
Less rainfall in the west, increasing water scarcity, greater probability of drought, greater likelihood of high fire conditions, and we see flooding in the east as you get more extreme heavy rainfall events and more heat waves everywhere around the country. And we'll even see heat extremes going up in metropolitan areas around the country. So things like Chicago in the 1990s having a severe heat wave that killed thousands of people. That kind of thing that would happen, maybe every 50 years or so, that will start to become more and more frequent. And it'll begin to happen maybe every decade or so, where places like Phoenix will still hit extreme heat for Phoenix. So even the temperatures in a hot place, they will go up and become even hotter.
Yeah, and the New York Times on September 25th did a large map in a section called Dangerous Days. Your hometown is getting hotter. And it showed that Miami, for example, the extra days of temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century for Miami, 78 more days if Miami isn't already underwater.
So what was something like a 1 in 100 event can become as often as every other year. And so these really extreme floods, extreme heat, these become much more common in the future and can have devastating consequences.
Right now, what are computer models showing to those of you who worked on the IPCC report about what we can expect, say, in North America in just the next decade, because we've already reached another 0.5 degree warmer and it's projected that we may go up to 2?
It could be substantially worse than even those best estimates.
But the politics of the planet don't seem to be supporting dramatic reduction in the greenhouse gases. In fact, it seems that some of the larger nations, the United States included, by adding coal now to an industry that we thought had ended, that we are going to be contributing ourselves to increasing amounts of greenhouse gases and accelerating the amount of warming so that we would be ourselves pushing the needle on the computer models in which there is even more rapid warming.
Well, unfortunately, you put your finger on it. My guess is that the politicians assume that the problems will only become more severe once they're out of office. And so if they are thinking of the next 2 to 4 to 6 years, which are most of the political offices, then they are assuming that they can cope with that short a period of time, and it will be somebody else's problem a decade or 2 decades from now.
Meanwhile, we're facing the fact that there will probably be a lot of people who are going to be forced out of homes and houses. And what is the United States and the world going to do with what has to be future migrations away from coastlines?
Certainly there will be, and in fact already are places that are having to be abandoned, both on the East Coast and in Alaska, due to rising sea levels, and that will only continue to get worse. We will have an increasing number of domestic migrants, but it's really the developing countries where there are far more people susceptible, where there are likely to be enormous numbers affected by sea level rise and forced to migrate as their cities become uninhabitable. And that's really one of the things that the report highlights, where you get millions of such migrants at 1.5 degrees, but you add many tens of additional climate refugees as you go up to 2 degrees. And that will be a problem for all the wealthy countries, because naturally you want to go somewhere where there are better prospects. And so I think we can expect North America and Europe and parts of Asia to see lots of migrants coming from low latitudes. And in fact, I think we've already been seeing that in Europe. That's part of the reason for the Syrian civil war and intense drought, all of the migrants that were coming up to Europe after that, which led to a lot of the crises there.
So doesn't that mean that there could be a tremendous amount of civil strife and wars over the migrations of people away from coasts?
Well, this has been something that has been identified by lots of American officials in the Defense Department and in the Central Intelligence Agency. During the Obama administration, climate change was considered a major threat multiplier and driver of probable future conflicts. And again, there's kind of a head-in-the-sand mentality that has taken root now in Washington, which seems to pretend that this doesn't exist. But this was widely acknowledged in the defense community as recently as 3 years ago.
So global climate change and increasing warmth could definitely bring more wars.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, well, it's a terrible future if we can't get this under control. And one of the big headlines this summer of 2018, 1 million Florida homes may see sea level rise flooding over the rest of this century. In fact, it is so bad that of the 48 continental U.S. states, Florida now has the most property at risk. A study finds that $351 billion worth of homes will be risking persistent tidal flooding. The researchers say if the global warming and sea level rise does continue, that in more than 1 million properties in Florida will have chronic flooding, and that when you look at the map as it is extended by computers over the rest of this century, that sea level rise, which is already one of the big secrets kept in Miami by the political institutions there, is that they get flooding constantly on full moons. They get constantly flooding on high tides. They get constantly flooding all of the time. And everybody who lives there knows it. And that political governments and mayors saying we're not going to let anybody know that we have flooding in the streets of Miami is nonsense. They've got to take the bull by the horns and deal with this. And as you look at the maps, knowing that the Arctic has melted 2 to 3 times faster than the computer projections. Well, George, when you look at these maps of what is expected to happen to Florida over the next 50 years, and know that what happened with the Arctic was 2 to 3 times faster, if Florida has water flooding, let's say, 3 times faster than the current computer projections, then it means that most of the southern tip of Florida will be uninhabitable.
Jeez.
And that leads back to what Professor Drew Shendell was saying.
And welcome back to Coast, Linda Moulton Howe back with us.
It's great to be back, and I'm going to start with the announcement of what I think is going to end up being the 9th planet of our solar system. And it actually goes back to a report that I did in 2003 on Coast and for Earth Files about a mysterious red-colored object that was discovered moving slowly like a planet at the very outer edges of our solar system.
That was a great story.
And the scientists who first reported that mystery were astronomers Michael Brown at the California Institute of Technology and his colleagues Chad Trujillo of the Gemini Observatory in Hawaii and David Rabinowitz at Yale University. They had been working together on a NASA-sponsored project called Near-Earth Asteroid Tracking. Well, that team contacted other astronomers who began to look for this object. It was red, and they labeled it just simply 2003 VB12. But after it was photographed by the Palomar Observatory, more study indicated that it was all ice. That was probably what was reflecting the red color. And it is one of the coldest objects in our solar system, with temperatures never rising above minus 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's why the astronomers decided to call the mystery object, now known to be an icy body, Sedna. And that was after an Arctic myth about a native woman who had been thrown into frigid, icy waters. Well, over the last 13 years, Sedna is one of 13 bodies that he has now found to have very odd, elongated, elliptical orbits. Sedna is probably one of the biggest, most strange. And these orbiting bodies are all clustered in the same section at the far reaches of our solar system, as if that something gravitationally is attracting them, holding them like a bunch of ducks that are following something very large but is invisible. And now Professor Brown at Caltech has discovered a much bigger object far beyond Sedna. In fact, he thinks he has discovered what might be a gaseous planet similar to Neptune, and that it is 10 times the mass of Earth and 7 times the distance from Earth to Neptune. And that distance is 19,565,000,000 miles from our sun. And Professor Brown just calls it Planet 9. He is the one responsible for having Pluto reduced down to an icy dwarf planet, and this one may replace that 9th position. Michael Brown has been professor of planetary astronomy at Caltech since 2003, when he did discover Eris, and that was more massive than Pluto, and set him to do a book that he called How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming, because it was too small to be a planet. Here now from Caltech in Pasadena, California, to talk about new Planet 9 is professor and planetary astronomer Mike Brown.
13 years ago, the discovery of Sedna was the first hint that there was something funny going on in the outer solar system. The peculiar thing about Sedna is it has a very elongated orbit, something like 12,000 years to go around the sun. And in addition, when it does go around the sun and it comes back close to the sun, it never gets very close to the sun. In fact, it's almost twice the distance of Neptune is the closest that it ever gets. It's very difficult to explain how an orbit like that got there. So when Sedna was discovered, we knew it was strange. We knew that we didn't have enough information to figure out what was going on with it. And we've actually been trying for the last 13 years to answer that question.
When I look at the graphic that came out with your January 20th, 2016 Astronomical Journal report about the gravitational evidence of a ninth planet in our solar system. There are 13 orbits all going to the left. The orbit to the right, labeled Planet 9, looks like is repulsing the other 13.
It's very strange, isn't it? This is something that we were also confused about when we first came up with evidence that that was the way that the orbits looked. We now finally understand they're in this gravitational interaction that forces them into this anti-line state. It's a little bit like Pluto and Neptune, which Pluto crosses Neptune's orbit. Neptune always pushes Pluto and keeps it in its place. They never actually come very close to Planet 9, and they're forced to stay in that position. There were actual objects who were physically aligned in space, all going off in one particular direction. Once you realize that, you start to immediately think that there must be something else going on out there.
Can you explain how you interpret this to hypothesize that there must be a ninth planet in the Kuiper belt that's 10 times the mass of the Earth?
Yeah, and I would say it's not in the Kuiper belt, it's well beyond the Kuiper belt. The basic idea was noticing that there was this pattern out there, but it's not a simple process. You don't just look at that pattern and say, oh, yeah, it must be a planet. It really did involve this detailed back and forth between computers and calculations and observations and just a lot of head scratching too.
And where exactly is it?
If we knew exactly where it was, we wouldn't have to be inferring that it's there. We would just go look at it and say, look, there it is. So we don't know exactly where it is because all we know is its long-term gravitational effect on these other bodies. We don't know where within its orbit it is. But we know its orbit pretty well, and we know the orbit pretty well because of all of these computer simulations which show if it's not massive enough, it doesn't affect the outer solar system. If it's too massive, it destroys the outer solar system. If it's not tilted the way we think it's tilted, it doesn't tilt the objects the way they're tilted. So all these details we can infer from these detailed computer simulations that we've been doing.
If something 10 times the size of the Earth is on that orbit, and it does come looping around the solar system at its closest approach, what would it do to the planets Earth and our neighbors?
The easy answer to that is absolutely nothing. The closest it ever comes to the sun is about 7 times the distance of Neptune. And it is a little bit less massive than Neptune. So having something less massive than Neptune 7 times further away means that it's something like 1% of the effect of Neptune. As it is, Neptune hardly affects the Earth. So there is nearly no effect at all. And if there were an effect on the Earth or on the Earth's orbit, it would be a lot easier to find because we have measurements of that really precisely. But I don't think we're going to find it due to its effect on the Earth.
Is it at the boundary between the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud?
No, there's a gap between the Kuiper belt and the Oort clouds. The Kuiper belt, I'll tell you everything in the units that we actually use, which is AU, astronomical units. 1 AU is the distance from the Earth to the Sun. And in those units, Neptune is 30 times the distance to the Earth to the Sun, 30 AU. The Kuiper belt is between about 40 and 50 AU. Pluto, for example, is right at 40 AU. Planet 9 is on a very elliptical orbit. The closest that it comes is about 200 AU, so it's well beyond the outskirts of the Kuiper belt. And the furthest distance it is probably something like 1,000 AU.
So a swing between 200 and 1,000 astronomical units.
Right.
And that's that big oval on this graphic.
Exactly. The Oort cloud is probably like 20,000 AU out to 100,000 AU.
Okay. So for people who have emailed me and said, could this be the planet Nibiru? There were several books by an author named Zecharia Sitchin who talked about a Sumerian Mesopotamian carved cuneiform in which a planet that would move, I believe it was every 3,600 years in orbit. Would you explain if this discovery of Planet 9 could in any way be what the cuneiform that Zecharia Sitchin analyzed said was a moving planet that orbited in a large elliptical pattern?
No, it's funny. Every time I discover something new in the outer solar system, that's always the big question. Oh, it must be this Nibiru thing that was predicted.
I think it is because it is cuneiform, and you can see it in the British Museum and others where the Mesopotamian had carved in stone different planets, and because there were more planets than we had originally counted with Pluto. That's why everybody thinks, is there a planet out there that is orbiting our solar system?
Yeah, unless they somehow had invented telescopes as big as the telescopes we have on the top of Mauna Kea today, then it seems really unlikely that they knew about this unless some conspiratorial aliens had come down and told them about that. That seems pretty unlikely to me.
Can you now describe this in terms of what you think is out there?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we know, of course, is that we know that it has to be something like 10 Earth masses to be able to have the effect that it does. And that makes it just a little bit less massive than Neptune. So our hypothesis is that it is a version of Neptune. And in fact, we even think we know where and how it formed. We think it probably formed at the same time alongside Uranus and Neptune, but then got a little bit too close to Saturn or a little bit too close to Jupiter and got ejected out to the outskirts of the solar system. We think it formed there, and we think it's like Neptune.
What about the orbital range that I have seen given as 10,000 to 20,000 years? Why is there that big, broad range?
The thing that we know best is how close it gets, because that's when it does most of its interaction with the outer solar system. It's harder to pin down how far it goes. So I keep on saying between 200 and 1,000 AU, but it might be more like 200 to 800 or even 200 to 1,200. And that range of distances will give you a variation between 10,000 and 20,000 years to go around the sun.
Which do you think is most likely?
I really don't know. The simulations, all the computer work that we've done so far, cannot answer that question.
What does the computer need to make the calculation?
There are two things that we need to do. One is it would be really helpful if we could find more objects in this cluster of objects like this. They will help give us more information about it. And the second thing we need to do is spend more time doing detailed computer simulations. Right now, this was about 6 months of supercomputer simulations to find the information we had. But now that we've zeroed in on what we think the interesting parameters are, we can look at more details now. And so we're just starting that process.
Does that now mean that our solar system is going to officially be back to 9 planets?
I don't think it's official yet. I think that we need to see it. But as soon as we see it, then absolutely yes.
Why is it that something so large would still be invisible to us?
It's really, really far away, so it's not particularly bright, but it's bright enough that we should be able to go find it.
What instruments can look and actually be able to see it?
The big telescopes of the world are the ones that we're going to be using to do it, and our favorite telescope for this task is the Subaru telescope on top of Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's the biggest telescope in the world that has a really wide field of view camera, and that's the way to do it. You get to look at a lot of sky at once, and we're heading out there in about 6 weeks to resume our search.
You will be there?
I will be there.
What would you estimate might be the time that it would take to discover with that Subaru telescope?
I think it will be found within 5 years, either by me looking or now some of the other people who are clued in that there's something out there to be found.
What will you be looking at in terms of infrared or?
Nope, just regular visible sunlight. It's sunlight that reflects off of Planet 9 all the way out there really far away and comes all the way back to us.
What will you be looking for?
Looking for a thing that moves just a little bit. We'll take a picture one night, come back, take a picture the next night, and look for the things that move.
So in 6 weeks, which would put you about the end of February, starting in March of 2016, you will be in Hawaii at the Subaru telescope?
Yes.
For how long?
Just a preliminary look at a certain patch of the sky, and that's only going to take, we're only going to be there for one night. And we're going to come back, take a look at what we see, and rethink exactly the right places and ways to look at stuff. The motion that we're looking for in March will actually be motion from last year to this year, and then we'll be going back there again in the fall to start to look in more details at certain spots. So it's a long process. It doesn't happen quickly, but we're on the task.
But why does it take 5 years?
We could do it in 1 year if we had the telescope dedicated to us, but mostly it's because it's a big sky that we have to cover.
And, George, there is a lot of competition in astronomy for telescope time. Yeah. You get it scheduled, you go to the telescope, you do what you need to do, but then it goes the next night to somebody else, and the Subaru telescope is going to be used for many other astronomical projects. So he explained that he expects that they will have one night of photographs, and then they're going to compare the March photographs of this particular wide-angle frame from the Subaru with plates that they know were taken over the last year or so. And what they're going to try to see is if they can see any movement between, let's say, a year ago or 2 years ago and this frame that they're going to take in March. But it could take 5 years because they can only get telescope time so often, and if they don't see that motion, they have to keep going back periodically to get new frames and do new comparisons. And throughout all of this, as competitive as it is to get telescope time, there's a new telescope that's being planned for construction on Mauna Kea, and they already have several there right now. I think it's a total of 13 telescopes. And a year ago, in April of 2015, the native Hawaiians protested the proliferation of observatories on what they consider to be their sacred mountain, Mauna Kea. And the protests actually stopped approval of this new, very much needed 30-meter telescope that would be up in kind of a little off, but where the cluster of the telescopes are. And things were stopped until a deal was worked out with the Hawaiian governor. And now what's going to happen is they're going to take down 25% of the 13 telescopes that are already there while they get ready to build this big new 30-meter that should come online in the mid-2020s. And by then, I would say that Professor Brown is going to know what is out there. This big mass, 10 times the mass of the Earth, is what is needed to explain that strange clustering of Sedna and those 12 other objects. And it's amazing that something could be that big and still be invisible, and that it's not warm enough to see an infrared, and he expects to be able to see sun. But get this, it's mostly hydrogen and helium. And hydrogen does have a freeze point. It's very low, down, near 400 degrees Fahrenheit minus.
Right.
But you can't get helium out of a liquid state into ice.
So do you think old Zecharia Sitchin, the late Sitchin, was right about Anunnaki and Nibiru and all that?
But where is the object that travels around 3,600 years?
Yeah,
But he may have misunderstood a number, and something like this hiding out in the Kuiper Oort cloud, when I say hiding, meaning we can't see it, might be there, but it's not on a 3,600-year cycle.
I talked with Seth Shostak from SETI, Linda, many years ago, and we both agree that the primordial soup in the universe that is in our solar system is the same everywhere. The complexity is the same. So if you can get an Earth-like object close to its star, its sun, you might get life.
Well, I think this is going to be a big gaseous planet like Neptune, but even Neptune is much more complex than we ever thought as we've gotten better photos. So we are at the beginning of moving to Mars, moving out into our solar system, and finding that what we thought were dead bodies are not.
There's lots going on in the field of ufology these days, of course. You might remember the counselor to President Barack Obama, John Podesta, as he was leaving the White House, simply saying one of his biggest regrets, not really completing his work on UFOs, trying to get to the bottom of that. Hillary Clinton, asked a question by a reporter, talked about that too. Let's go back to Linda Moulton Howe with an incredible update. Go ahead, Linda.
That's right, George. John Podesta was born January 8th, 1949, is married, has 3 children, served as chief of staff in the second Bill Clinton administration, was White House counselor to President Barack Obama, overseeing climate change and energy policy. He was in the White House from December 2013 until he resigned in February 2015 to become the chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. During Bill Clinton's administration, John Podesta helped the president write Executive Order 12958 that led to the declassification of 800 million pages of American diplomatic and national security historic documents, but nothing very good about UFO documents, even though the executive order introduction includes these words, quote, "Our democratic principles require that the American people be informed of the activities of their government," close quote. John Podesta has also been known as a big fan of the TV series X-Files, the first broadcast on September 10, 1993, and it was centered around investigations of UFOs and an alien presence on Earth. Well, last year, Hillary decided to run for president, and Podesta began to tweet about UFOs and aliens and Hillary. By December 30th, 2015, during campaigning in Conway, New Hampshire, Hillary was talking with reporter Damon Steer at the Conway Daily Sun. He had asked Hillary about UFOs in her 2007 first presidential campaign, and now asked her again in his December 2015 interview. He reported Hillary said with enthusiasm, quote, "Yes, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I think we may have been visited already. We don't know for sure," close quote. Then she added that her 2016 campaign manager, John Podesta, quote, "has made me personally pledge we are going to get the UFO information out one way or another. Maybe we could have, like, a task force to go to Area 51 in Nevada," close quote. And keeping track of the John Podesta, Hillary, and Bill Clinton interest in UFOs is Grant Cameron from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He produces and reports the excellent website presidentialufo.com. Grant's books include UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government, UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informants, and most recently his third book is Alien Bedtime Stories, released in February 2015. That has a lot of information about Hillary and Bill Clinton's interest in UFOs and their communications with Lawrence Rockefeller in the early 1990s about declassifying government UFO files for all Americans. I asked Grant why John Podesta, working as a counselor in the Barack Obama White House, would publicly tweet about UFOs on February 13th, 2015, the very day he left the White House to run Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Here now, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, is Grant Cameron.
It was the day John Podesta was leaving that he put this out, which could be very embarrassing if you understand, like, this could all sort of backfire. I mean, you could suddenly have reporters wondering what's going on. So this is why these are extremely significant tweets, is that John Podesta is a very powerful guy. People know who he is. And to the last day that you leave the administration to put out a very open challenge on UFOs and that you want UFO disclosure, I think it makes the tweet very, very important. And here it is. This is from February 13th, 2015. Finally, my biggest failure of 2014. Once again, not securing the disclosure of the UFO files. And then he puts the truth is out there, and then he copies New York Times Dowd.
Maureen Dowd.
And it was retweeted 1,221 times.
Can you read what else he has tweeted since the February tweet?
He makes the tweet to Lena Dunham. This is the girl that she does an interview with Hillary on video.
An actress?
Yes, this is September 29th, 2015. He says, great interview, Lena Dunham. But Lena, ask her about the aliens next time. And then he puts the truth is out there, and then he copies Hillary Clinton. So this is significant because you got to remember that John Podesta is Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and that political campaigns for president cost $1 billion or more dollars. This is big money. And everything is polled. They don't do anything without making sure that it is polling. People have to remember that in a campaign, you don't really care if you're a Democrat who's voting Democrat, because you're going to get a solid percentage. You're going to vote Democrat every time. You don't really care about the Republicans who are voting all the time. It's the swing voters that you want. And these tweets are very significant, coming from the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, which means that he has polled the issue and that it's going to get a positive reaction from the swing voters. Everybody's after the swing voters, and you're after the swing states. You don't care about Montana, North Dakota, Texas. These are all states where it's already been decided. So they're in New Hampshire, and one of the reporters in New Hampshire works for the Conway Daily Sun, and Hillary goes for a meeting with the board at the Conway paper, and this reporter had asked her in 2007, when she was campaigning in New Hampshire, about UFOs. And she had said, oh, yeah, she was interested in it. She was pretty open about it. And she actually made the statement in 2007 saying, do you know what UFO is the most requested item at the Clinton Library? That's significant because those were all the FOIAs that I filed. Hillary is aware of what had happened. So this time when she meets with the board of the paper and they're talking about all sorts of different subjects, the interview ends, and then he said it was about 90 seconds he had with her, and she didn't go off the record. He asked her again about UFOs, and it was at that point that Hillary says, oh, yeah, I'm interested in this. John Podesta and I promise that we'll get to the bottom of this, and we may even send a task force to Area 51. Then the most significant thing she says, and this has never been from any politician I've ever heard, she actually says they may have visited already, which is significant because lots of people believe there's life out there. The big question is, can they be here? And she actually makes this statement. So when he gets that, he puts the article out, and he's going to another meeting, and he comes back, and this thing has gone viral around the world, and people are phoning him from all sorts of news agencies and stuff. I've had a number of conversations with him since. He has talked to other reporters, and he said he has complete support from his editorial people, the editor, and people at the paper, and they want more. And he intends, if he can, to talk to all the people that are still campaigning in New Hampshire.
In addition to her saying that she thought that life could already have been on Earth, she said if she were elected, she'd think about putting together a committee to go to Area 51 and investigate.
Yes. I think she's taking some of that from John Podesta. He was the chief of staff for Bill Clinton, and he's, of course, famous for X-Files. And when he was still at the White House, they had written a major article on him about his fascination with the X-Files. And he had stated that he would always go home every time there was a new X-Files. And he famously talked about the fact that he phoned Area 51 when he was at the White House to ask whether they had this alien, what's going on at Area 51. So this is where this Area 51 keeps coming up. And when Bill Clinton goes on the Kimmel show, he also talked about it in 2005 in Hong Kong at an event with a bank there where he was giving a speech. The guy who was organizing it asked Clinton the UFO question, and he talked about it there as well, that he claimed that he had sent people to Area 51 to investigate whether they had this alien and this base underground, because that, of course, was the theme of Independence Day, which ran when Bill Clinton was in office. This whole idea about the president and Area 51. Before, Clinton didn't use the name Area 51 because it was still classified, but now he will actually use the term Area 51. So Hillary's working off that as well. She's talking about the Roswell thing and Area 51 because Bill always talks about it. It seems to be like there's certain things that they can talk about. So when they talk about UFOs, they talk about these two items, Roswell and Area 51.
Now, in 2002, John Podesta was at the National Press Club in Washington on behalf of his group, the Freedom of Information Coalition. He stated publicly, quote, "It is time for the government to declassify records that are more than 25 years old and to provide scientists with data that will assist in determining the real nature of this phenomena," close quote. Why is it that John Podesta has been trying to open up the truth about UFOs, interactions with other intelligences in this universe and this Earth? Why does John Podesta keep making these statements and pushing behind the scenes?
There's two things. Number one, whatever got him into the UFO thing, he's fascinated with X-Files. Even in his office, when he was at the White House, he had all sorts of X-Files paraphernalia in the waiting room going into his office. For whatever reason, he's fascinated with the subject. The other thing that's very important to realize about John Podesta is he's what I call a Madison guy. The Madison Institute is based on open government. And John Podesta, if you read his speeches, if you read some of the material that he put out in the 1990s, you will see that he is adamant. He is a firm believer that a population cannot be governed unless the people have the information. So he's not just doing it like a lot of politicians just because it sounds good. He actually believes this. He believes that the people have to have the information, and he believes this with the UFO thing, that if the people have the information, whatever comes out, they will make the right decision. And so when he makes the statement at the Sci-Fi press conference in 2002, he adds, because it's the law. He believes this. He firmly believes that it is the law that people should have the information and that this should not be withheld. This is illegal. It should be brought out.
Is there anything in your research going back to the early 1990s when Hillary was working behind the scenes so strongly to try to get her husband, Bill Clinton, to open up the UFO field, and she was talking with Lawrence Rockefeller? Is there any understanding that you have about how much Hillary and Bill Clinton do know? How much does John Podesta know? And what is it that keeps them, when they are at the height of power, from being able to leverage open everything?
That's where I sort of differ from, I think, a lot of UFO researchers. Most researchers believe that the president doesn't know what's going on. And a lot of people, when it comes to Clinton, will reference a statement that Bill Clinton made to Sarah McClendon. Sarah McClendon went to the president and said, Mr. President, why don't you do something about what this group is demanding? Why don't you do something about UFOs? Supposedly the president leaned over and said, Sarah, there's a government inside the government and I don't control it. That's where this idea came that Bill Clinton really didn't know what was going on, that the secret government had sidestepped him. I used to believe that, but I no longer believe that. I absolutely believe that the president knows what's going on. So what I say is happening is that this idea that the president doesn't know what's going on is something to create this plausible deniability. So when Bill Clinton talks about it, he always says, well, I couldn't figure out what was going on. If people think the president knows what's going on, then they're going to ask him what's going on, and he doesn't really want to answer the question because there's a lot of it that he really doesn't have the answers to. So I believe the presidents know when you win the presidency, you get what's called the intelligence briefing. It'll happen this November, 2 weeks after the election. Whoever wins the election will be sat down by the CIA director who's in there right now. They sit you down. They don't read you all the secrets, how many governments have been overthrown, how many people got killed, the UFOs, and then get you to sign the secrecy thing. They sit you down and you sign the secrecy oath before the briefing begins. Once the president signs the secrecy oath, the president is sworn to secrecy. So the president has to work backwards, and that's what's happening. That's why Bill Clinton in 1995 signed the executive order to try to force out the UFO documents, and it didn't work. But he did force out, John Podesta helped him to write this executive order. They forced out 800 million pages of classified material. They were hoping the UFO stuff came out, but it didn't come out. Same as John Podesta when he comes out about this tweet about the thing in 2014 I'm most disappointed in was that I didn't get UFO disclosure. It basically says, I talked to Barack Obama about this. We tried to get this, and everybody's hands are still tied. We can't get it out. So he's making it public because he did say to the Washington Post, the same as Hillary knew that I filed all the FOIAs with the Clinton administration, Podesta knows I'm filing FOIAs on him as well. He told the Washington Post at one time, he said, I've got to make this public because I know people are going to file FOIAs on me. He knows I'm filing FOIAs. All correspondence between Podesta and Bill Clinton, between Barack Obama and Podesta. He knows that in history people are going to record what he did. So that's why he does the tweet. He says, he's just putting it on the record. I tried to get it out again in 2014 when he was at the White House. I couldn't get it out, and he's just putting it on the record.
And, George, all of this makes bringing into clearer focus what happened back in September 14 to 15, 1993, when I, Dr. John Mack from Harvard, Robert Bigelow, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, Bruce Maccabee, C.B. Scott Jones, we were at the JY Ranch at Jackson Hole with Lawrence and Mary Rockefeller and Bootsy Galbraith And Mr. Rockefeller had asked this group of us to bring whatever was our latest research. This is 1993, and that's September. We were not aware at the time. This has to do with Lawrence Rockefeller feeling that he had both a responsibility and I think a right as an American tax-paying citizen to demand of the new Clinton administration that based on the information that he, Lawrence Rockefeller, was gathering from all over the place about UFOs and knowing it was real, knowing ETs are real, that we're not alone in the universe, that administration just had to open it up. As Podesta said, it is illegal to keep this kind of information from the American public. And it is fascinating looking back. I was there. I was with him. We heard his questions. We did not know what was behind the scenes that he was holding as a kind of velvet thread, that he felt that the Clinton administration should open all of this up.
Was talking with Stephen Bassett, and he was so disappointed that Hillary was not asked a question about the UFOs in her debate.
I know the reporters, I don't understand this world. It's like
it was right there.
He's throwing glitter in the air and saying, ask her about
please.
UFOs.
Somebody ask her.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do it.
I'm willing.
Well, you think we're ever going to get the bottom line to this?
I think we're getting motion, George, on somebody somehow. Things are beginning to crack open. I think it's almost as if some line has been crossed, that now the inevitable direction is out into the solar system, and that everybody on the planet has to learn something about UFOs, ETs, and that the old notion that we are alone in this universe is preposterous, and our government has known that that was not true since at least the early 1940s, if not before.